In Maricopa County, Arizona, Valerie Turner's name carried a certain weight. By 2022, the 54-year-old had built a reputation that went beyond her immediate neighborhood. Friends and relatives described her as resilient, practical, and committed to the people she cared for. Those who knew her best often pointed out how much of her life had been defined by duty to her family, duty to her work, and most of all, duty to her only son, Julius. Valerie had spent more than 2 decades working in state government administration before taking early retirement. Coworkers remembered her as dependable, someone who rarely missed a day on the job and never shied away from responsibility. Retirement gave her the space to focus on her extended family, hosting gatherings and staying actively involved in the lives of her nieces and nephews. For many in the family, Valerie's home was the central hub, where Sunday dinners, holiday cookouts, and milestone celebrations took place. Her reputation for strength grew out of the struggles she endured early in life. Valerie married young, but the marriage collapsed within a few years. When her husband left, she was left to raise their son, Julius, on her own. Those close to her recall that she never hid the difficulty of single parenthood. She worked long hours, stretched every paycheck, and refused to let her son go without. That persistence became one of her defining traits. By 2022, Valerie was beginning to think more about the future. With retirement funds, a modest home in Maricopa County, and savings she guarded carefully, she was intent on ensuring her legacy benefited those who valued hard work. She had started having private conversations with close relatives about her estate, though those discussions never centered on Julius. To most of the family, it seemed Valerie was preparing for the next chapter of life, one centered on herself after years of sacrifice. Those closest to her saw a woman who had weathered abandonment, raised a child alone, and earned the respect of an entire family network. To the outside world, Valerie Turner embodied perseverance. But beneath the surface, in the fragile bond between a devoted mother and a restless son, cracks were already forming. And in a matter of weeks, the family matriarch who had held everyone together would become the center of a tragedy no one could have predicted. By 2022, Valerie Turner's son, Julius, was 28 years old and still adrift. Unlike his mother, who built her life on discipline and persistence, Julius drifted in and out of jobs with little consistency. Records and family accounts show a pattern. He would take on warehouse shifts, short stints in retail, or temporary labor positions, only to quit within weeks. He often left behind unpaid bills and burned bridges with employers who described him as unreliable. Julius never established a clear path forward. He had no degree, no long-term career, and no steady income. To family members, he played off his situation with easy charm, joking about waiting for the right opportunity or insisting he had plans in motion. But privately, he leaned heavily on Valerie for survival. Even as an adult nearing 30, she still paid part of his rent at times, covered his phone bill, and kept him stocked with groceries. She was, in effect, the financial safety net that kept him from collapsing entirely. The arrangement came at a cost. Valerie, known for her firmness, often reminded Julius of his responsibilities. Relatives recalled hearing her scold him about overdue rent or question how he managed his money. Those conversations embarrassed Julius, and though he laughed them off publicly, behind closed doors he grew increasingly resentful. To him, each reminder felt like an attack on his manhood, a signal that his mother didn't believe he was capable of independence. Debt was another constant in his life. Julius borrowed freely, from friends, from extended relatives, and often from payday loan services in Maricopa County. When repayment time came, he turned back to Valerie for help. On several occasions, family members watched Valerie quietly bail him out to keep his credit from collapsing entirely. It was a cycle. Julius would promise change, find temporary work, then return to old patterns. To outsiders, Julius carried himself with confidence. At family cookouts or gatherings, he was sociable, cracking jokes and helping to keep the mood light. Younger cousins looked up to him, and older relatives often remarked on how personable he was when he chose to be. But beneath that exterior, there was no foundation, no savings, no stable work history, and no sign of maturity. What unsettled relatives most was the growing dependence on Valerie, even as Julius tried to project independence. He wanted the image of a man in control, but his life was tethered to his mother's support. Relatives began to notice the contradiction. He would boast about new plans or claim he was getting ahead, yet the bills still arrived at Valerie's door. In private conversations, Valerie confided that she worried Julius lacked direction. She expressed frustration that her sacrifices seemed to yield little progress, and she sometimes questioned whether she had been too protective. By then, Valerie was considering how best to secure her assets for the future, and she no longer assumed Julius would be the one to carry her legacy. For Julius, the unspoken tension between pride and dependence deepened into something darker. He wanted to prove himself, but without the discipline or stability to do so, each reminder from his mother felt like another wound. To the family, he remained the charming, easygoing cousin who could lighten the room. But in private, he carried a growing sense of resentment toward the one person who had kept him afloat. In Maricopa County, where family bonds often ran deep, Valerie's relatives saw her support of Julius as part of her strength. But for Julius, that same support was a reminder of his shortcomings. And as the year unfolded, the contrast between his mother's reputation and his own struggles would become the fault line on which tragedy was set to erupt. In the spring of 2022, another name began to surface more often in conversations around Valerie Turner's household: Tamara Porter. At just 25, Tamara had already lived through a turbulent young adulthood. Raised in a fractured home on the south side of Phoenix, she grew up moving between relatives, friends' couches, and short-term rentals. High school teachers later described her as bright but distracted, someone whose potential was cut short by instability and a lack of consistent guidance. By her mid-20s, Tamara had been in and out of low-wage jobs, mostly in retail and food service. She carried a string of short-term relationships that ended as quickly as they began. Friends from her past recalled that Tamara's greatest insecurity was not having a stable foundation, no permanent place to stay, no savings, no steady partner. When she met Julius Turner through mutual acquaintances, she saw in him the possibility of what she had always lacked: consistency. For Julius, Tamara filled a different void. She was younger, impressionable, and quick to support his version of events. Where his mother reminded him of his failures, Tamara reinforced his image of independence, encouraging his talk of new plans and future successes. In the early stages of their relationship, the two became inseparable. Tamara, with her unsettled past, saw Julius as her chance at building stability. Julius, craving validation, saw Tamara as someone who believed in him without question. But Valerie Turner viewed the relationship differently. As a mother who had spent decades holding her family together, Valerie was quick to notice patterns others might overlook. She saw Tamara as someone without grounding, a young woman whose lack of direction mirrored Julius's own failures. Valerie worried aloud that Tamara encouraged his irresponsibility, and she was not shy about voicing her disapproval. According to relatives, Valerie cautioned Julius that Tamara was holding him back and urged him to focus on work and stability rather than chasing another relationship that demanded resources he didn't have. These words, meant as maternal guidance, landed differently with Julius. Already sensitive to criticism, he began to view Valerie's disapproval as an attack not just on his girlfriend but on his ability to make decisions for himself. Each warning from his mother reinforced the belief that Valerie saw him as incapable of standing on his own. In private, Julius reframed the situation. To be with Tamara was no longer just about love or companionship. It became, in his mind, a test of loyalty. Tamara never openly asked Julius to choose between her and his mother, but her presence created a quiet divide. She expressed frustration when Julius deferred to Valerie for money or advice, often complaining that he needed to stand up for himself. Those frustrations, combined with Valerie's outspoken disapproval, pushed Julius further into the mindset that siding with Tamara meant defying his mother. For the Turner family, Tamara was simply another girlfriend in Julius's life, someone who might fade from the picture with time. But Valerie's concerns grew sharper. She sensed that Tamara's influence was different, that she fed into Julius's desire to appear independent without grounding him in real responsibility. Valerie warned relatives that Tamara was enabling Julius, allowing him to drift further from the accountability he desperately needed. By mid-2022, the bond between Julius and Tamara had strengthened, even as the gap between Julius and Valerie widened. What began as a simple relationship evolved into something more symbolic. To Julius, Tamara was no longer just a girlfriend. She became proof that he could reject his mother's authority. Each time Valerie disapproved, Julius only dug deeper into his loyalty to Tamara, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon spiral beyond anyone's control. By mid-2022, Valerie Turner had begun quietly planning for the future. After more than 2 decades in state government service, she had built a modest but secure foundation for herself. Her assets included a small single-story home in Maricopa County, a state pension she had carefully managed since retirement, and personal savings accumulated through years of disciplined budgeting. Valerie was not wealthy by any measure, but she had enough to ensure comfort and to leave something meaningful behind for her family. Those closest to her knew she had grown uneasy about Julius's instability. Time and again, she had covered his late payments, paid off his payday loans, and settled debts that seemed to reappear every few months. To Valerie, each bailout felt like enabling. Privately, she began to question whether leaving her estate to Julius would secure her legacy or simply fund a cycle of irresponsibility. She started speaking with her sisters and trusted relatives about making changes to her will. Her intent, she explained, was to redirect much of her estate toward her nieces and nephews, the younger generation she believed would use the support to build stable lives. Family members recalled Valerie's reasoning as pragmatic, not spiteful. She often said she wanted to put money where it could grow. While she never announced these plans formally, several relatives were aware of her intentions. To them, it seemed like a natural decision for a woman who had always prioritized responsibility and accountability. But Julius learned of these discussions by accident. During a Sunday gathering in April 2022, he overheard a conversation between his mother and an aunt about revising legal documents. Valerie, speaking in a lowered voice, mentioned that her home and savings would be split among nieces and nephews instead of being left solely to her son. Julius caught enough to understand the implication. His mother was preparing to cut him out. That moment marked a sharp turn in his perception. Until then, he had framed his conflicts with Valerie as arguments about Tamara, about respect, and about independence. Now, overhearing plans to alter her will, he saw her disapproval reaching far deeper. In Julius's mind, this was not only an insult to his judgment, it was the deliberate erasure of his future. For Julius, the will represented more than money or property. It became proof, in his eyes, that Valerie intended to strip him of his rightful place in the family. Combined with her constant criticism of Tamara, the news hardened his belief that his mother was no longer on his side. Each reminder of responsibility felt like another step toward being replaced. Investigators would later point to this period as the critical shift. The discovery of Valerie's plans did not create Julius's resentment, it magnified it. What had once been tension between a mother and her adult son deepened into something more dangerous. Julius began to view his relationship with Tamara as his last line of loyalty, and Valerie's decision to change her will as a betrayal that could not be ignored. By late April 2022, the strain between Valerie Turner and her son Julius was no longer hidden behind family gatherings or casual conversations. The disagreements that had simmered quietly for years now erupted openly, often centering on money. Valerie had noticed irregular withdrawals from her checking account and confronted Julius directly. To her, the pattern was unmistakable. Money meant for bills and savings was disappearing, and she suspected Julius was funneling it into supporting Tamara Porter's lifestyle. Investigators would later uncover fragments of this tension through text messages and phone records. Julius confided in Tamara, telling her his mother was trying to ruin us, and warning that Valerie might shut down the limited financial support he still relied on. He framed the situation as a struggle not just between himself and his mother, but as an attack on his relationship. In his retelling, Valerie's actions were not about financial discipline. They were about keeping him and Tamara apart. Tamara's role in this period was complicated. By most accounts, she never encouraged violence. Friends who spoke with investigators described her as frustrated with their unstable situation, tired of living on the edge of eviction notices and unpaid bills. In conversations with Julius, she voiced irritation about his dependence on Valerie and insisted he needed to stand on his own 2 feet. What she meant as a push toward independence, Julius interpreted as pressure to take action against his mother. This distortion became a critical turning point. Julius, already consumed with resentment over the will and his mother's constant criticism, began to view Tamara's frustration as validation. To him, her words were a signal that he had to prove loyalty, to demonstrate that he could put their relationship above his mother's authority. It was not Tamara who drew that conclusion, but Julius himself, twisting her dissatisfaction into a dangerous narrative. By the final week of April, Valerie confided to one of her sisters that she feared Julius was slipping beyond her reach. She worried openly about his temper and his refusal to accept accountability. At the same time, Julius's communications with Tamara revealed a growing fixation on the idea that Valerie's disapproval was destroying their lives together. As the second Sunday in May 2022 approached, Valerie Turner began planning what had become a family tradition, hosting a Mother's Day cookout at her home in Maricopa County. For Valerie, these gatherings were more than celebrations. They were her way of keeping the family anchored. She had built her reputation on being the dependable figure everyone could turn to, and Mother's Day was the perfect occasion to reaffirm that role. She spent the week making calls to relatives, confirming side dishes, and arranging for extra seating in her backyard. Nieces and nephews promised to stop by, her sisters agreed to bring desserts, and cousins offered to help with the grill. For Valerie, this was a chance not only to be honored as a mother but to highlight the broader importance of family unity. Relatives later described her excitement as genuine. She wanted the day to reflect both celebration and stability. But for Julius Turner, the upcoming event carried a very different weight. Investigators later determined that in the days before the gathering, Julius took a step that would seal the course of events. Records show he purchased a firearm through an acquaintance, a weapon he kept concealed in his car and later in his bedroom. There was no legitimate reason for him to own it. Julius had no steady employment, no legal purpose for carrying, and no history of hunting or sport shooting. Detectives concluded that the acquisition was deliberate, tied to the mounting tensions with his mother. Text messages recovered from his phone revealed vague but troubling hints. In one exchange with Tamara Porter, Julius wrote, "After this weekend, things will be different. Tamara responded with casual encouragement, interpreting his words as a promise to take control of his life. But investigators later noted the chilling double meaning. The statement was as much about ending Valerie's influence as it was about proving himself to Tamara. Meanwhile, Valerie had no reason to suspect that danger was near. She focused on the menu, the weather forecast, and making sure her front yard was tidy for visitors. In her eyes, Mother's Day would be another chapter in her long history of bringing the family together. She had no knowledge of the firearm her son had obtained or the resentment he carried into the preparations. On the morning of May 8, 2022, Valerie Turner's home in Maricopa County came alive with the sounds of family. By noon, the backyard was filled with folding chairs, children running between tables, and the smell of grilled food drifting through the air. Relatives recalled the atmosphere as warm and familiar, exactly the kind of gathering Valerie had always been known for. For her, Mother's Day was not just about receiving flowers or gifts, it was about gathering her family together and standing once more as the matriarch who held them all in place. Valerie moved easily between the kitchen and the yard, checking on side dishes and greeting each arrival with hugs. Her sisters helped arrange desserts, cousins unpacked coolers, and nieces and nephews pitched in with setting up tables. Witnesses later told investigators that Valerie appeared happy and proud that day, smiling as she watched the generations mingle in her home. It was the kind of scene that would have reinforced her role as the backbone of the family. Julius arrived later in the afternoon, bringing Tamara Porter with him. Those present remembered his entrance as calm, even cheerful. He greeted relatives, hugged a few younger cousins, and walked alongside Tamara as though the tension of recent weeks had evaporated. For family members who had worried about growing conflicts between Julius and his mother, his demeanor came as a relief. Nothing in his behavior suggested hostility. Investigators later pieced together accounts showing how carefully Julius maintained the facade. He helped carry chairs into the backyard, fetch drinks for guests, and posed for photographs with Tamara and his cousins. In several of those images, later retrieved by police, he appeared smiling, arms draped casually around relatives, standing just feet away from Valerie. Witnesses would later describe this as one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, the apparent normalcy of Julius's behavior in the hours before the violence erupted. Tamara, too, blended into the gathering. Though Valerie had expressed disapproval of her relationship with Julius, she remained polite. Relatives said Valerie was cordial but distant with Tamara, never unkind but not overly warm. Tamara, for her part, stayed close to Julius, chatting quietly with a few cousins but avoiding deeper conversations. To most, she appeared simply as his partner, another face at the family table. The cookout unfolded as planned. Valerie gave small toasts to her sisters, thanked everyone for coming, and made sure her nieces and nephews had enough food. In every way, she embodied the role she had carried for years: provider, organizer, and matriarch. Family members later told investigators that it was a day of laughter and music, marked by nothing unusual until the final moments, when everything changed. At approximately 5:15 p.m. on May 8, 2022, the Turner family gathering in Maricopa County took a sudden and irreversible turn. Just moments after Valerie Turner finished her Mother's Day toast, her son, 28-year-old Julius Turner, stood from his seat, drew a firearm, and without warning fired directly at his mother. Witnesses described a chilling sequence. There was a brief silence following Valerie's final words, the clink of glasses, and the start of casual conversation. Then, the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. Several family members initially thought the sound was fireworks. Within seconds, the screams began. Children ran for cover, relatives dove behind tables, and the backyard erupted in chaos. Valerie, struck in the chest, collapsed mid-sentence. Those closest to her rushed forward but quickly realized the wound was catastrophic. She died instantly, never regaining consciousness. Witnesses told investigators that the image of Valerie falling to the ground, her glass slipping from her hand as her family scattered around her, would remain seared into their memories. Relatives later recounted the surreal moment of realization. The gun was still in Julius's hand, and for several seconds, no one moved. They had gathered to celebrate mothers, to honor the woman who had held their family together, and instead they found themselves watching a son murder his mother in cold blood. One cousin described it as the most unnatural thing you could ever see on Mother's Day of all days. Panic spread through the yard. Children cried out for their parents, chairs toppled, and guests scrambled to escape. Several relatives attempted to approach Julius, shouting at him to put the weapon down. Others pulled younger family members into the house for safety. Through it all, Julius remained rigid, standing over the spot where his mother had fallen. Tamara Porter, seated near Julius when the shooting began, screamed and moved away as relatives rushed to intervene. She later told investigators she was in shock, unable to process what had just occurred. Family members pulled her aside as others focused on restraining Julius. According to reports, 2 male cousins tackled him to the ground, forcing the weapon from his hand while others called 911. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene had descended into devastation. Officers encountered family members crying in the front yard, neighbors gathering in confusion, and relatives holding Julius pinned until deputies placed him in custody. Paramedics confirmed what witnesses already knew. 54-year-old Valerie Turner was dead at the scene. Investigators documented the aftermath with photographs and testimony. Plates of food sat untouched on the table, balloons and decorations still hanging in the yard. The contrast between the festive setting and the violence that had just unfolded became one of the defining images of the case. The symbolism was unavoidable. On the very day meant to honor her, Valerie Turner's life was taken by the son she had raised alone. Paramedics confirmed that Valerie Turner had died instantly. Her body remained in the backyard, surrounded by overturned chairs and scattered food plates. Family members wept openly as officers worked to secure the scene. What should have been a day of celebration had turned into a crime scene, marked by bloodstains against the backdrop of balloons and decorations. Tamara Porter, who had been seated just feet from Julius when the shooting occurred, was visibly shaken. Officers separated her from the rest of the family and noted that she repeatedly insisted she had never wanted any violence. According to the incident report, Tamara sobbed as she told detectives that Julius had been frustrated for weeks but had never revealed a plan to kill his mother. She cooperated fully, handing over her phone and answering questions late into the night. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline almost immediately. A search of Julius's phone revealed a series of text messages that added chilling context. Days before the shooting, he had written to Tamara, "After Mother's Day, everything changes." At the time, Tamara appeared to interpret the statement as a vague promise about turning his life around. But investigators would later cite it as evidence of intent, a premeditated decision that he carried into the celebration. Further examination of financial and phone records confirmed the earlier purchase of the firearm through an acquaintance just days before the killing. Detectives also uncovered that Julius had overheard conversations weeks earlier about Valerie's plans to adjust her will, redirecting her assets toward other relatives. Combined with his ongoing financial struggles and the escalating conflicts over missing money, investigators concluded that Julius's resentment had been building to a breaking point. Witness interviews painted a consistent picture. Relatives described Valerie as proud but firm, a mother who demanded responsibility from her son even in adulthood. They recalled recent arguments over money and Valerie's growing concern that Julius was sliding further into debt. Family members also confirmed her disapproval of Tamara, describing it as a frequent source of tension between mother and son. What shocked investigators most was the calm with which Julius entered the gathering that day. Photographs from the celebration showed him smiling alongside cousins, carrying chairs, and blending into the atmosphere as though nothing were wrong. Hours later, those same images would serve as evidence of how carefully he masked his intentions. By the close of Mother's Day, Julius was booked into the Maricopa County Jail on suspicion of first-degree murder. The case file now included witness statements, digital records, and physical evidence linking him to a crime that had unfolded in full view of his family. For relatives, the shock was twofold. Not only had they lost Valerie in an unthinkable act of violence, but the killer was her own son, someone they had celebrated with only minutes before. The trial of 28-year-old Julius Turner opened in Maricopa County Superior Court in the fall of 2022. From the outset, prosecutors presented the case as one of entitlement and rage, arguing that Julius had grown resentful of his mother's discipline and financial boundaries. They emphasized that the act was not spontaneous, but carefully chosen. The symbolism of committing the crime on Mother's Day was, in their view, proof of a calculated decision to make a statement in front of the very people who had celebrated Valerie Turner as the backbone of the family. The assistant district attorney described the killing as an execution carried out for defiance, not survival. She pointed to evidence of premeditation, the purchase of the firearm days before the gathering, the text message to Tamara Porter promising that, after Mother's Day, everything changes, and the decision to conceal the weapon until the moment of the toast. Jurors were shown photographs from the cookout, images of Julius smiling alongside relatives just hours before the shooting, contrasted with crime scene photos documenting the chaos that followed. One of the most emotional moments came when Tamara Porter was called to testify. Taking the stand under subpoena, she recounted her relationship with Julius, her frustrations about their unstable life, and her repeated insistence that she never wanted violence. Through tears, she explained how Julius had framed the act as a kind of gift to her, telling her privately that his mother was an obstacle and that, once removed, their lives would finally improve. Tamara stressed that she had never asked him to harm Valerie, describing her horror when he drew the gun in front of the family. The prosecution leaned heavily on this testimony, arguing that Julius had twisted his girlfriend's frustrations into a justification for murder. In their closing arguments, they told the jury that Valerie's life had been stolen as a warped offering on the very day meant to honor her sacrifices. Defense attorneys attempted to counter with claims of diminished capacity. They argued that Julius had struggled with depression, financial pressure, and feelings of inadequacy that clouded his judgment. They suggested that his decision to shoot his mother was the result of a sudden mental collapse rather than deliberate planning. Psychologists for the defense testified about Julius's long history of dependency and resentment, framing the act as impulsive. But the evidence of planning was overwhelming. Jurors were reminded of the gun purchase, the concealed weapon at the cookout, and the message promising change after Mother's Day. Prosecutors emphasized that Julius had maintained composure throughout the day, even posing for photographs and helping with preparations, before choosing the precise moment of Valerie's toast to open fire. That, Myers told the jury, is not impulse, it is intention. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just under 7 hours before returning a unanimous verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Court observers noted that Julius sat expressionless as the verdict was read, while members of Valerie's family embraced one another in the gallery. For them, the trial confirmed what they had witnessed firsthand, that Valerie's life had been ended not by accident or impulse, but by a deliberate act of violence carried out by her only son. In December 2022, the case reached its conclusion in Maricopa County Superior Court. After his conviction on charges of first-degree murder, the sentencing hearing drew dozens of Valerie Turner's relatives, many of whom had witnessed the crime unfold. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief as family members prepared to speak publicly about the impact of losing Valerie in such a violent and public way. The judge delivered the sentence with little hesitation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She described Julius's actions as a calculated, irredeemable betrayal, emphasizing that the crime had been carried out deliberately, in full view of those who loved Valerie most. Julius sat silent at the defense table, offering no statement before his punishment was handed down. The victim impact statements underscored the depth of the family's loss. One of Valerie's sisters spoke tearfully about her generosity, recalling how Valerie had opened her home countless times to relatives in need. Another relative described the shock of watching her fall to the ground during what should have been a joyful celebration, saying, "That image will never leave us. Mother's Day will never mean the same thing again." In the months after sentencing, Valerie's home was sold, her estate distributed as she had intended. Relatives described the process as painful, a reminder that her careful planning had not prevented the very outcome she most feared, that her only son could not be trusted with her legacy. The Turner case remains one of the most haunting examples of family betrayal in Maricopa County. For those who lived through it, the horror was not only in the act itself, but in its timing. A celebration meant to honor a mother's sacrifices became a scene of unspeakable violence, forever redefining what Mother's Day meant for everyone who gathered in Valerie Turner's backyard.